Let me, with that, just introduce our speaker, and that's Dr. Keith Swenson. Keith, as you'll see, he used to head up the Design Science Association for 20 years. That's a similar organization to what we have here, Apologetics Forum. He brings in speakers as well, and some of us have spoken at that before. And so he used to run that. He's now I guess an adjunct professor at Multnomah University, teaching on things to do with biology, geology, and as we alluded to before, he does lead many creation tours as well. And this is what he's going to talk about. You know, the devastation when it occurred on Mount St. Helens, secular science says, they'll take decades to restore the biology, the growth there. Well, he's going to talk about what really happened and how that recovered very quickly. So with that, Keith, let's welcome Keith.
Well, how many of you witnessed the eruption of Mount St. Helens? Raise your hands. Quite a few, quite a few. We are the ones with good memories. The rest have forgotten it, right? Is that the reason? Yeah, we survived. Could be true. Okay. How many of you have visited Mount St. Helens, the National Monument? A lot more. Well, great. It's a place that we can learn a lot. We can learn a great deal. Well, the topic that I want to talk about this evening is biological recovery at Mount St. Helens. And I've got a lot of slides, so I want you to direct a lot of your attention right up there to the screen. The flood in the days of Noah, which according to the Bible was global, catastrophic, and occurred only a few thousand years ago, disrupted all biological systems on the entire earth to an incredible degree. The natural world was, in essence, you might say, put through a blender. Genesis chapter 7 describes the biological impact this way. It says that every living thing that moved on the earth perished. Birds, livestock, wild animals, all the creatures that swarm over the earth, and all mankind. Everything on dry land that had the breath of life in its nostrils died. Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. Man and animals and the creatures that move along the ground and the birds of the air were wiped from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those with him in the ark. Likewise, the Apostle Peter, referring to the flood, says, "Whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished." Yet amazingly, over the tens, hundreds, thousands of years that have followed since the flood, plants and animals, other organisms recovered, producing ecosystems like we see on the modern earth, like this magnificent old-growth forest you see in Northern California. But you can ask, is such a belief reasonable? Is the biota really that resilient? Could biological recovery actually occur following a global cataclysm on the scale of Noah's flood, especially within the biblical time frame of a few thousand years? And if recovery did occur, how did we get from there to here? That is, from barren flood and volcanic sediments worldwide to old-growth forest, to tropical rainforest, savanna, desert, Arctic tundra. By what ecological or scientific mechanisms could such remarkable transformations occur? And to answer these questions, we first can begin by asking, what sources of information do we have? What can we possibly look to for help? And I've listed the 5 main ones. We have the Bible. We possibly have other ancient records other than the Bible. We have the geological record. We have a discipline that's called biogeography. And we have the study of modern biological disturbances. Let me just mention each of those briefly. Now here, of course, is where we begin our study, with the Bible. Of course, the Bible doesn't tell us all that we want to know. What the Bible says is true, but it's not exhaustive. It doesn't say everything. I mean, just try looking up biological recovery or Mount St. Helens in your concordances, and you don't get anywhere. But the Bible is our foundation. It's our foundational source of information. It is where we start in attempting to understand biological recovery. It gives us the big picture, the proper worldview, the framework into which we can fit our scientific observations. For example, the Bible, in no uncertain terms, teaches that the earth, the surface of the earth, was once destroyed by a global flood event, and that afterwards life really did recover. Now, the left part of the slide summarizes what I know about other ancient records that would tell us about the flood or recovery right after the flood. I really don't know of any, but there could be some, but I'm not aware of. But the book on the right is of some interest to us. Not that it tells about what happened after the flood, because it doesn't talk about the flood, but it tells really what the final product of post-flood recovery was, at least for much of the earth. The book's called A Forest Journey. And the author, Mr. Perlin, has collected documents from various parts of the world, like Mesopotamia, Iraq, and Greece, and Cyprus, and Crete, and Spain, and Italy, and England, and many other nations, which today are rather devoid of timber, and he has shown that they were once densely forested. So I think it's reasonable to think that much of Earth's land surface, for much of the Earth's land surface, the end result of post-flood recovery was some sort of a forest. Well, here we see Grand Canyon, a great place to visit and spend some time. And much of what we know about the flood comes from studying the geological record. When you look at this, it's like a stack of pancakes, layer upon layer of sedimentary rock containing fossils. And they all have names, all these layers. At the top is the Kaibab limestone, and then we have the Redwall limestone halfway down, and there's the peat sandstone way at the bottom. Layer after layer after layer. And now scientists who are geologists read these layers like you and I read the pages of a book. And so knowledge of what the flood was like, as we learn from this record, greatly aids our understanding of what happened following Noah's flood. Another source of information is the field of biogeography. That's the science or the study of the distribution of plants and animals on the earth today. And from these observations, one can speculate about how various organisms got to where they are found today. For example, why do giraffes reside on the African savanna? I suppose except for these in the San Diego Zoo. Why don't they live in Australia or South America? These are questions of biogeography. And then lastly, and of really special interest to us today, we can study biological recovery following disturbances. In ecology, disturbances are anything that upsets an ecosystem. And so we can have wildfires, like in 1988, much of Yellowstone National Park burned and is recovering, and that's been studied. There can be local floods, even big floods like tsunamis. There can be windstorms, even hurricanes, disease, avalanche, glaciers, human-caused disturbance like clear-cut logging. But none of these has nearly the intensity of the last one, which is volcanic eruption. And no volcanic eruption ever has been studied as much detail as was Mount St. Helens in 1980. And that includes biological study as well as geological. This is a bibliography from 1993 on the biological research generated by the 1980 eruption. And it lists 637 article references and contains 70 abstracts of research in progress. And there's much more than that written today. One would think, therefore, that a careful review of what was learned at Mount St. Helens should greatly assist creationists in reconstructing or trying to construct a reasonable understanding or a reasonable model of what post-flood biological recovery was like. And so that's the topic I want to explore in the remainder of this program. Well, now let's look at Mount St. Helens and what it was like prior to the 1980 eruption. That is its pre-disturbance state, we'll say. Mount St. Helens was once called the queen of the Cascade Range. It was youthful in its appearance, snow-clad, frequently likened to an ice cream cone. It was one of the most beautiful mountains in the Pacific Northwest. And extending from its flanks like a vast green blanket draped over the landscape were thousands of acres of pristine forest and also clear-cut forest and plantation forest. Peaceful Spirit Lake is seen in the shadow of the mountain here. But the tranquility of Mount St. Helens was deceptive, and the indigenous peoples knew that. You can look at what they called the mountain. Tawan Latkla means fire mountain, and Lawi Latla, one from whom smoke comes. So it appears that the Klickitat and the Cowlitz and the Chinook peoples understood Mount St. Helens' true nature. The landscape around Mount St. Helens before 1980 also gave evidence of past volcanic cataclysm. Volcanic boulders littered the forest floor in places. Igneous flows determined the course of streams, like we see here at Lava Canyon. And even much of the soil was derived from the weathering of volcanic material. Yes, Mount St. Helens is one of those strange places where the soil actually falls out of the sky. Here's timberline on Mount St. Helens. And timberline also showed evidence that volcanic disturbance had occurred in the not too distant past. Timberline was low, it was suppressed, lower than on the neighboring mountains. Before 1980, it was like 4,200 feet, and Mount Rainier was 2,000 feet higher almost, 6,000 feet. And so why was the timberline so low? Well, it had been reduced to a very low level by the eruptions of the 1800s. And then it was gradually reaching up, advancing upward towards its climatologic limit, but it just hadn't had enough time to get there. So that was evidence of fairly recent volcanic disturbance at Mount St. Helens. Also, there's all kinds of other things that have happened at the mountain. There's been forest fires and windstorms and other disturbances as well. And so one author, in discussing this, wrote the following. He says, "The plant and animal species that are returning to the mountain slopes have seen it all before. For them as species, it was no unique event, and our studies of colonization must take that into account." In other words, and that's an important statement, in other words, it is saying that before the eruption, the flora and fauna of Mount St. Helens was already adapted to recovering from major disturbance. It had been there, done that, as the expression goes. Well, we could go on and describe much more about Mount St. Helens before the eruption, but time really doesn't permit us to do that. So let's move on now to the disturbance itself, the eruption. And it was on a beautiful Sunday morning of May 18th, 1980, and several of you remember that, I'm sure, very well. On that morning, cataclysm fell on the Mount St. Helens landscape. The toll on biological systems was staggering. Act 1 of the volcano's performance that morning was something that hadn't been appreciated, hadn't been seen before. The mountain erupted sideways. Not upward, as you'd expect, but sideways, laterally, over the landscape to the north. In a span of about 3 minutes, that lateral eruption destroyed or devastated 230 square miles of that lush green forest and transformed it into a gray, lifeless appearing moonscape. You can see in this photograph taken before the eruption, there's Mount Rainier in the distance because we're looking to the north. And you can see the forested Mount Margaret backcountry and the hills and mountains that are north of Mount St. Helens. And there's Spirit Lake. It looks a little bit like two lakes, but that's only one lake, Spirit Lake. And then, of course, look at the forest in the foreground there. That's all old-growth forest and big trees. Now, what I want to do is to just show you the next slide, which was taken from approximately the same location from a helicopter hovering at this location. It couldn't be on the mountain because the mountain was no longer completely there. And see if you can see any difference now between before the eruption and after the eruption. Notice that? Let me do that again just in case you missed it. See, that's before the eruption, and that's after. That's quite a change, isn't it? Mount Rainier is still there, pretty much untouched. But what you're seeing there is part of the blast zone, that 230 square miles of land that was devastated by that lateral blast and by the other things that happened, of course. The forest looks like it's gone, but actually you can see part of the forest very well because it's floating on Spirit Lake. About 1 million logs and other components of a forest are floating on Spirit Lake. And pay attention to the foreground. There's this flattish surface. It's all gray and so forth. Well, that was the old-growth forest that I pointed out. It's now called the pumice plain because the forest is deeply buried and basically gone. Well, over 4 billion board feet of timber was felled. This is enough to build 400,000 three-bedroom houses. Most of the animals residing above ground died. There simply was no place for them to hide. Here's the death toll that's estimated by Washington State Department of Game. Fish in the terms of salmon and trout, only 11 million individuals were killed. Birds, 1 million, that is all the birds in the blast zone. There was no way for a bird to survive out there. 1 million individual birds. About 11,000 snowshoe hares, 5,000 black-tailed deer, 1,500 Roosevelt elk, 1,400 coyotes, 300 bobcat, 200 black bear, 15 mountain goats, and 15 cougar. Those are the estimates. And then in addition, unfortunately, 57 people were determined to be dead or missing, including someone in this vehicle. Now here's an important slide to get a grasp on. This is a map showing the blast zone. And we'll start out at my arrow there at the base. That rests right in the crater of Mount St. Helens. And from that crater, there's a red area flowing out towards the north, and that's the pumice plain, where a lot of hot pumice deposits came out of the mountain and landed there. And then if you look to the left of that red area, there's this lighter colored material. Well, that's the landslide, the top 1,300 feet of Mount St. Helens that avalanched down the Toutle River Valley, and that's where most of it sits today. The tan area, which is the biggest part, is where the forest was blown down and devastated. Close to the mountain, the forest simply left. The soil, the trees, everything became part of the blast and moved, it flew. But further out, the trees were simply knocked down and still lay there today. Around the edge is kind of a hatched area. And that's called the scorch zone, or the zone of the standing dead, because the blast went out that far and it was still hot enough to cook the trees and kill them, but not strong enough to knock them down. So many of them are still standing today. And of course, extending away along the river systems draining the Mount St. Helens area, we had mud flows that flowed down the Toutle River and other places. And then, of course, over this whole area, ash fell for 9 hours that day. The arrow is important also, and it's important in our talk. It's a gradient of disturbance. It starts, the base of the arrow is at Mount St. Helens, the mountain itself, where the intensity of disturbance was the greatest, and the destruction of life was the greatest. And then it extends out to areas where there's less and less and less intense destruction and more survival of organisms. And so that gradient would go out eventually, if we went beyond what shows on the map here, to an area where there was no disturbance or no effect. It's a gradient of disturbance. You might predict, for example, that recovery would be a lot slower at the base of that arrow, where there was intense disturbance, and much less as you moved out, and that indeed has proven to be the case. Also, another point here, that any scientist who's going to study biology in the biological recovery or what happened biologically needs to ask two questions. And the questions are these: what was my study site like before the eruption? Am I doing a study in what was an old-growth forest or a clear-cut or a meadow or what? Where am I in terms of what was here before? The next question is, what happened here geologically in my study site? Am I at a place where there was a mud flow, or I'm in the blow-down forest, or am I on a debris avalanche, or what kind of a place am I in terms of the geology? What happened from the volcano? Well, several years ago, I reviewed the literature on biological recovery in the blast zone and attempted to relate it to recovery following Noah's flood. And that's the article that resulted, and the Institute for Creation Research used that for a few years on their tours of Mount St. Helens. And as I read through this voluminous literature, it became apparent that there were really many recurring themes or recurring principles that surfaced over and over again as I read through what had been learned. I listed a few of them here. Let me just mention the first few. Resilience is the ability of an ecosystem, like a forest, for example, to recover from a disturbance. And the mountain has done that very well. Also important is what happened geologically, the geological context. Weather and climate has been important. The presence or absence or amount of water in an area is very important. The next term was coined at Mount St. Helens. It's called biological legacies. And that new term simply means the biological materials, living or dead, that survived the disturbance. Like a pocket gopher underground that survived became a biological legacy of the eruption. And a tree trunk that was totally killed that still lays there is still a non-living biological legacy. And it turned out that understanding those legacies was one of the most important aspects of trying to understand recovery. There's immigration and several others that I'll pass right now. We'll touch on some of these coming up. So the question then is this. The big question for us is, do these recovery themes that we see at Mount St. Helens provide any insight into how the Earth recovered biologically in the post-Noahic flood period? In other words, are there general principles that are illustrated here that apply to many or even all severe or major disturbances? Well, what I'd like to do now is take you on a tour through the blast zone and show you some things of interest and also point out some of these ideas, these themes or things that we see operative out there. And then after that, we'll try to wind it up by trying to make some a little speculative but reasonable comparisons to what must have happened after Noah's flood. So I'm going to start in the crater. And this is a telephoto view I took of the crater. I think it was from Harry's Ridge. And it shows the horseshoe-shaped rim of the crater. The rim is intact to the east and to the south and to the west, but you can see it's gone to the north. It was blown out by that lateral blast, and that hole is called the breach. Within the crater, you see the lava dome, which is a volcanic plug that's developed over the vent of the crater. And actually, that was taken a few years back because in 2004 up to 2008, a second lava dome developed behind that one that's there today. There's also a glacier that's formed in the crater. You can't see it on this picture. You just see snowpack, but there is a glacier called Crater Glacier. If you want a closer look at this crater, you've got two options unless you have access to a helicopter. Number one, you can climb the south rim of Mount St. Helens. You can do that with just a climbing permit and end up on the rim right in the middle of the picture there. Or the other thing you can do, if you have a research permit, is hike or climb rather up the slope from the north here, just right into the crater and just walk right up to the lava dome. So let me take you on both of these trips quickly here. And here in 1998 is our daughter Stacy climbing the south face of Mount St. Helens. She later told me this was the hardest thing she'd ever done. I was kind of happy to hear that, actually. It was challenging, but she made it very well. We are now on the rim, and we are looking east, and that's Mount Adams, about 35 miles away. To the left is a snow cornice that you don't want to step on because it may be a quick trip into the crater if you do. And the crater is, of course, off to the left. Now, here's Stacy again. And if she would turn directly around, this is what she would see. Sort of the opposite picture of the crater I showed you before. This is looking to the north. And there's Mount Rainier way out there. And you can see the blast zone, or parts of the blast zone, and there's Spirit Lake in the blast zone visible. And there's a lot of snowpack, and I think you can see a little glacial ice there in the lower left side of the crater as well. But one of my first recollections as we got up on the rim of the crater was that of two ravens. They came from behind us, from the south, and they dramatically just swooped right down into the crater. It was very exciting to see, and somehow that sticks with me. The other thing that we saw in climbing the mountain was that there were lots of hummingbirds all the way along up the mountain because the alpine wildflowers were in bloom, and they were after the nectar. Going back to 1980, just days after the eruption, the geologists were in the crater with their orange flight suits on, and they were working with the rocks, and they heard strange buzzing noises about them. And they didn't know at first what it was, but it turned out they were being dive-bombed by hummingbirds, who probably thought the geologists were the biggest orange flowers they'd ever seen. Remember now, I told you, all the birds in the blast zone were killed by the eruption. No place to hide. So all birds observed in the blast zone, at least early on, or from then on, were immigrants, because there were no legacies, no living legacies of birds. And so all the birds that came in there had to come from the surrounding forest or from a greater distance, perhaps. And so immigration is a very important concept in thinking about recovery. Things had to either survive or they had to immigrate in. There was no other choice. You can contrast birds with some other species, like there are woodland salamanders, which don't move around very much. Some of them are termed sedentary. It would take them eons to get in. Total contrast with what birds can do in their immigration. Well, here's another route now into the crater. This is Dr. Stephen Austin, and he's leading us up through an erosion gully on the north side of the mountain. And we're going to ascend into the crater, and we're going to pass by a canyon called Step Canyon that's about 700 feet deep. And that canyon was not there before the eruption. That formed rapidly by mud flows after the eruption. And it goes, in part, it's going through solid lava flows, at least that top part of it you can see. So we followed that up, and we entered the crater. And look at all the living things. Well, there's one little plant by my arrow there. You can see it. But there's something that shows a lot more life than that. The waters of Step Creek were green. And they were green because of photosynthetic microorganisms living in the water. And again, a very simple, basic principle is that aquatic systems recover far faster than do terrestrial or dry systems. That's true throughout the blast zone and certainly explains some of the things we see in recovery. Several other organisms had been seen in the crater by this time. It was 1993. There were various species of insects and mice and Pacific tree frogs of all things, a few bird species, some other plants, and so forth. And there's more than that today, of course. But by and large, this is a pretty tough place for recovery to occur in. In fact, I don't think you should call it recovery because prior to the eruption, no life existed here. This was the inside of the mountain. If you're familiar with the terminology of ecologists, you'll maybe recognize that this is what they call primary succession, the colonization by life on a surface where no life has existed previously. And of course, that's a rather slow process. The crater, you can say, is also just plain inhospitable. It's cold with deep snowpack in the wintertime and hot and dry like a desert in the summertime. And it's geologically unstable. You can see a rock fall coming down there when we were in the crater. In fact, there were several of them. So when you go in the crater, you don't go near the edges. You stay out in the center. And another basic principle that I'll show you a few times here as we go through is that geological stability is required for biological recovery to occur. Plants don't colonize collapsing crater walls or valleys repeatedly scoured by floods, for example. Well, let's leave the crater, go down by Step Canyon, and visit the pumice plain. And there it is. That's a few years after the eruption because it was once pretty much almost totally flat, and now it's been eroded somewhat, but it gives you a pretty good idea what it looks like. And so in contrast to the crater where nothing lived, down here there was a huge old-growth forest before the eruption. You saw it in that photograph I showed you. But because that forest was blasted, incinerated, and deeply buried, like up to 600 feet of volcanic material, nothing survived. Absolutely nothing survived. And so recovery here also is an example of primary succession, recovery on a surface where no life has existed. This is the type of barren substrate upon which recovery occurred and is occurring, and it's called desert pavement. The high winds up there will blow away the fine fragments of ash and the dusty sort of stuff, and then leave the bigger pumice fragments as more of a stable surface. There is a problem, however, And the problem is that these volcanic substrates, they don't have the nutrients that plants need. Particularly, they don't have nitrogen. But even on this nitrogen-poor and nutrient-poor surface, plants did start to recover. Since there were no surviving organisms, of course, seeds had to blow in on the wind to start these plants. The first plant to appear on the pumice plain was a prairie lupin. You're probably familiar with lupin, and this is a particular high elevation species of lupin. This seed probably came in on the wind. And the plant was found in 1982, in the summer, by researchers Charlie Crisafulli and James McMahon. And here's Charlie Crisafulli. He's an ecologist, and I think one of the most knowledgeable people working on Mount St. Helens. I had the pleasure of spending a day in the field with him a few years back. Well, anyways, Charlie's lupin proved very prolific. It was found in 1982, and by 1989, there were over 169,000 progeny. Somewhat similar to this view, which is taken on the Plains of Abraham, a different site on the mountain, but it would look about the same. That lupin, that single lupin, proliferated greatly. Now, lupin is really important as a pioneer plant on a surface like a volcanic surface, because it does something important. It fixes nitrogen. No, the nitrogen isn't broken, but if you're familiar with the term, lupin has some special bacteria that live in little nodules in the roots of the plant, and they take nitrogen from the air, which plants can't use, and they convert it into chemical compounds which plants are able to use. In other words, lupin makes fertilizer, and it adds it to these nutrient-poor pumice deposits. That helps the lupin, but it prepares the way, the surface, for the coming of other plants, including the conifer trees. Here's alder. There's two species of alder up there, Sitka alder and red alder. And this alder here also fixes nitrogen, does what the lupin does. And so here we see the development of soil. The rock is weathering and will form the mineral component of soil, and the alder leaves, full of nitrogen and organic compounds, will form the organic part of the soil. Currently at Mount St. Helens, there are whole mountainsides totally full of, just packed with red alder like this. And in a decade or two or three or four, the conifer trees will be taking over more and more, but they will be taking over because the alder prepared the volcanic surfaces so that they could grow there. Many other plants are reclaiming the pumice plain. This is a struggling fir species of some type. And actually, what this is the beginning of an old-growth forest. It just has a long way to go. But that's the way a forest would start. Here's a lonely lodgepole pine. This alpine plant is called partridge foot. Here's one of my favorites. It's called pussy paws. It's a alpine plant, and the floral structures lie flat on the surface, and it's a good adaptation when you have a very windy environment. But on the pumice plain, by far the fastest recovery is where the streams go, along the water. Same thing we saw in the crater. Here's a water-loving plant called Lewis monkey flower. Well, let's leave this pumice plain now and look at an even greater example of recovery that has to do with a watery or aquatic ecosystem, that of Spirit Lake. Spirit Lake died on May 18, 1980. The lake is located just north of Mount St. Helens, and the south shore is the pumice plain. And on the morning of May 18th, about a third of the debris avalanche that fell off Mount St. Helens plowed directly into Spirit Lake. And that caused the water of the lake to slosh over 800 feet up onto the mountains at the north of the lake. And that giant wave or waves picked up an entire old-growth forest. Giant trees, 1 million of them, soil, other plants, animals, everything. And it carried all that material back into the lake basin, which by then had elevated 200 feet with the debris avalanche in place. Sort of a new basin had appeared while the water was out of the lake. And later that day, oven-hot, boiling pyroclastic flows, just not lava flows, but this pumice would just flow out of the crater and flow into the south shore of Spirit Lake. And then throughout that whole day, of course, the ash fell from the sky into the lake. And so the first rescue crews came and flew over the lake, and they reported back. One that I have talked to is Michael Cairns, and he said he reported back the lake was gone. And the headline of the Oregonian newspaper on the Monday after the eruption said, Mount St. Helens decapitated, not a Spirit Lake gone, 9 killed. Well, it was more than 9, but Spirit Lake looked like it was gone, and the Oregonian said so. Why did it look like it was gone? Well, because they couldn't see any water there. What was on the lake? It was the floating forest, the logs, and also floating rock. Because not only does the soil fall out of the sky at Mount St. Helens, the rock floats. Pumice floats for a period of time. So they couldn't see it, but it was very much still there. When scientists returned to Spirit Lake, they reported it had, quote, been transformed into a roiling, steaming body of degraded water choked with logs and mud. This is not that. This is taken a little later, but it's the best photo I could come up with. And scientists predicted it would take a long time, maybe 10, 20, 30 more years for that water to reach any sort of a pristine condition. But it took less than 5 years, actually, in reality. How then was Spirit Lake reborn? It's a complicated story of microbiology and chemistry, but let me just give you a brief version of it quickly. Following the eruption, the waters of Spirit Lake were warm, saturated with organic debris from that forest, had a lot of mineral nutrients and some toxic chemicals in it. It was really a toxic brew. And in that brew, bacteria proliferated to an astounding degree, so much that the bacteria used up all the oxygen in the lake's water. And with the oxygen gone, the only organisms that could live there would have been anaerobic or non-oxygen requiring bacteria, and they just filled the lake. And the lake was said then to boil like a cauldron because those bacteria were causing carbon dioxide to escape and methane and hydrogen sulfide and so forth. And the odor was overwhelming. Some of the researchers that went down there and worked in that developed an illness that became known as the red zone fever. But then, amazingly, due to a succession of different bacterial types and physical processes like wind and waves and winter rains and sunshine and so forth, Spirit Lake started to heal. And well within 5 years, it had reached a pre-eruption quality. That was amazing. The first rainbow trout in the lake was found in 1992. It was promptly named Harry, after, probably some of you know who that was named after. And of course, no fish could have survived in those oxygen-depleted waters. So the question is, where did Harry and his kin come from? And the prevailing opinion is that someone illegally stocked Spirit Lake. The trout are continuing to do well. Now, going on from the lake, here's part of that debris avalanche. These mounds are called hummocks, and they are semi-intact parts of the summit and north slope of Mount St. Helens. So there's Mount St. Helens right there. And remember this debris avalanche or big landslide. Part of it went into Spirit Lake. But another part of it went up and over a 1,000-foot ridge, which is now called Johnston Ridge, and here we can see it going up and over a ridge and then down the other side. But most of the debris avalanche went about 14 miles down the North Fork Toutle River, where it lies today. Notice now that we are moving outward on our gradient of disturbance. We're out here now where this stuff was cool, this debris avalanche. A few plant fragments survived. Not that many, but some did. So we're going out to where it's not quite as intensely disturbed. In this photograph, you can also see a couple other things. The importance of water, because the alder there is growing along a stream in the foreground, and that's where things recover. Do you see any recovery on the eroding slopes of the hummock? No, because geologically unstable surfaces do not recover rapidly. Let me tell you one other thing. It's just kind of an interesting story. One of the first people to come out on this debris avalanche was a geologist named Fred Swenson. Don't get confused. There was also Don Swenson, but he was a head geologist for a while there. But Fred Swenson was working on the debris avalanche 10 days after the eruption, May 28th. And just as geologists are in the habit of doing, he was digging holes, and they looking at the layers and so forth. And as he did that, he noticed something that puzzled him and that he couldn't explain. In all of this ash and pumice, there was all these fine spider-like little filaments that were just all over the place. And he didn't know what it was, but he later learned that these were probably the first biological responders to the eruption, the first biological response to the eruption, because these were filaments of a fungus known as fire fungus, because in our forest fires we will find certain spores of fungi only germinate when they get heated up, and then after the fire you've seen certain mushrooms and so forth. And these are fire fungi. Well, the volcano did the same thing. It heated up the surface of these hummocks enough that those spores germinated. And what happened after that? Well, they formed mats of fungus, and on those mats of fungus, mosses started to grow, and then other plants and so forth. It's as though the ecosystem was designed with that capability of recovering from disturbance, like somebody thought it through ahead of time, maybe, and it's designed to do that. Another thing on the debris avalanche deposit, here's an erosion gully. No surprise. You can see the plants are doing reasonably well on the sides, on the stable surface there, but in the where it eroded away, plants aren't doing very well. That's just what we've said. Need geological stability, but not always. Here's early in the recovery, and it's the opposite. Early in the recovery, when the areas were covered with pumice deposits, the plants were buried. And where did the plants recover? Well, in the erosion gullies, because the water would run down, erode away a gully down to the old soil, and allow, therefore, the plants from the old soil to recover. Just the exact opposite, as you might predict. Among the hummocks, there's a lot of ponds and wetlands, and so the eruption destroyed a lot of habitat, but also created a lot of new habitat. And these ponds are good habitats to find a lot of plants and animals in, and we see a lot of cattails and willows and the duckweed floating on the pond, and there's horsetail you may recognize. There's a plant called Eurasian milfoil, not a real welcome one, but that's a non-native invading plant. You might say, how did that thing get in there? It crowds out our native plants. And well, the way it got there is it flew, because this stuff attaches to the feet of ducks, and ducks flew it in, and it's all over the place now. We also find animals when we look around the debris avalanche. Here on a willow leaf is a moth caterpillar and a dragonfly, and there's a red-legged frog looking out at us. And on the debris avalanche, we also find Pacific tree frogs, the cute little green guy there on the volcanic rock. And this is a closer view of him. This little frog has dispersed even as far as the crater, of all places. Sometimes on the shores of these ponds, you find they're just black with tadpoles. In this case, that's the western toad tadpole. And here are newly metamorphosed toadlets. Huge numbers were seen at times. In fact, there was a hiker was out on this area, and he was walking along and saw a hillside in front of him that was just moving, he thought. And he wondered what that was. And as he got closer, he found the whole hillside was just total toads, hopping toe to toe. And so populations of animals there was kind of a boom and bust situation where populations of something would just explode in growth and then crash and die. It was a very unstable place. The main reptile you might encounter is a garter snake. The birds on the debris avalanche would be those who don't need trees to nest in, like the junco that we see around here so often. There's the nest, and there's a successful nest. The young are there. The wetland birds started to come back because there were ponds. There's a red-winged blackbird. Also on a debris avalanche, you'd find strange trees like that. Kind of a weird-looking one, but that's caused by a certain animal. And so is those scratches on an alder there is caused by the same animal. And here the animal has left its sure sign of its presence. I thought that was a nice composition. And here's a track, and you probably have figured out what we're talking about. Sometimes they leave their bones after a tough winter. And here's the animals themselves, the Roosevelt elk. 1,500 elk were killed in the eruption. No elk in the blast zone survived, but of course they immigrated in from the outside. And they have proven important in plant recovery, because what do? Well, first of all, they browse on plants, and they control plant populations, which actually is important. But they also feed outside in the forest, eat plants, and then come into the blast zone, and in their droppings, they leave seeds. So they bring a lot of species of plants into the blast zone. Charlie Crisafulli, who I showed you his picture, he has gone down for several seasons to where the elk congregate on the pumice plain and collected elk droppings, brought them home in plastic bags, and put them in his refrigerator, carefully labeled, I think, leaves them there for 2 months of cold, and then puts them in his greenhouse. He plants them, and he finds out what the elk are bringing in, and he's identified a large number of species of plants. The other thing that elk do is they make flower pots. They make, in the soft pumice deposits, they would make footprints, and those footprints would collect water and be moist inside, in the depth of the footprint. And then all the organic material blowing across the pumice plain and the seeds and so forth would accumulate. So with seeds and organic material and water, great place for plants to recover. So like flower pots, and the elk were helpful that way. Let's move now to the blowdown forest zone. That's what much of it, the blast zone, looked like. Pretty impressive blowdown of trees there. Huge amounts of biological material, both living things and dead things, persisted here. So there was just a lot of biological legacies, and so therefore this area recovered much more rapidly than the other areas that we've looked at. And again, biological legacies was determined to be the single most important determinant of how fast an ecosystem would recover. Lingering winter snowpack was present in May, and so that allowed a lot of survival of organisms underneath the snow. Here's Mita Lake Basin. Some of you probably visited that. This was an old-growth forest. The forest was toppled by the blast, and underneath the snowpack were a lot of small silver fir, Pacific silver fir, and they just exploded in growth once the big trees were gone or competitors were gone. Now they started to grow. So it shows the power of biological legacies. Trout survived at Mita Lake because it was ice covered. That's a brook trout. So did northwestern salamanders. They can walk around quite some distance, and they're not sedentary like the ones I mentioned before, but these were in Mita Lake, under the ice. They survived. And it is remarkable that the western toads that we talked about and this salamander are able to traverse kilometers, like miles, of this barren pumice deposits to get to ponds that were just very close to Mount St. Helens. And you wonder, how in the world could that happen? And the reason was that, well, first of all, many of them traveled and tried to disperse outward, and they simply died. But there's 2 times during the year when they made it, during the spring rains and the fall rains, when everything was wet. The other thing they did is take the subway, because under a lot of these pumice deposits, there's a network of tunnels made by the northern pocket gopher, and the amphibians, like this salamander, would traverse underground great distances. I've had the experience of looking down pocket gopher burrows and seeing western toads looking right back at me. And here's the evidence of the tailings of a pocket gopher, and here's the critter himself. We think of gophers as being a nuisance in our garden, but it turned out the gophers were heroes at Mount St. Helens. They brought up the old soil along with seeds, and so on the gopher mounds, plants recovered, just like they did on the elk tracks. And of course, they also made these tunnels we talked about. Numerous forest plants survived, like the avalanche lily, the bunchberry, the wood violet. An interesting question came up is, which would recover quicker, the clear-cuts or the old-growth forest? Turned out the clear-cuts did better initially. And the reason is, I think, probably obvious. The clear-cuts were already recovering. They had all these pioneer plants like fireweed that you see here, growing, and so the plants just had to come up through the ash. The old-growth forests also got their fireweed growing real well too, and did about equally well in the long haul. There's a closer view of fireweed. Huckleberries are there and very good to eat. Let's move on just briefly to the bugs of the blowdown forest. I'm sure you would like to see that. There's a butterfly I just passed over, a checker spot. But following the eruption, many scientists predicted the return of insects to the blast zone would be extremely slow. Look at this quote. There seemed to be justification to believe that it would be impossible for insects to recover at all. It's kind of an overstatement, but there's reason for it. Why would bugs not do well? Hard to understand that, isn't it? And the reason is that volcanic ash is an insecticide. Dry volcanic ash that falls on insects abrades their waxy outer layer and causes them to desiccate. Testing. Come on. Okay. So they desiccate, they lose their water, they dry up and die. It also plugs up their breathing pores and their intestinal tracts. And so a very effective insecticide controlled insect populations in the blast zone. Of course, grasshoppers are there and plentiful, and they eat a lot of plants, which actually helps control plants, and that's actually beneficial. A tiger beetle is seen when you hike. You run across these all the time. Now here's a spider. And spiders are numerous, and they came in very early into the blast zone. And you might say, how did they get in there? Did they just crawl in on all eights or what? The answer is they flew. Because a large number of species of spiders do what's called ballooning. The juveniles get out on the branches of trees and shrubs, and on a breezy day, they let out a long silk thread, and they just let go, and they sail for kilometers across the landscape. And it was estimated that 2 million spiders fell per day in the blast zone in a square mile during the recovery period. And so I guess it's a good reason to wear a hat maybe when you're up there. But numerous birds have returned to the blast zone. Those that hammer on dead wood for a living, like woodpeckers, of course, have done very well. Like the northern flicker, I couldn't find a good photo of a flicker. That's the best I could do, but that is from a flicker. The beautiful mountain bluebird, which you can see in the middle there, lives in woodpecker cavities, so it's doing well. All the birds died, and they estimate 27,000 blue grouse died, but they're back, and that's a grouse in its courtship display. Mammals have returned. No, that's not a chipmunk. It doesn't have a stripe across its face, and it's too big, so that's a golden-mantled ground squirrel. It's doing well. Beaver have come in, as you can see from these cuttings. They didn't survive, but as the plants recovered along the streams, they just ate their way up into the blast zone and are abundant there today. There is a beaver dam in the foreground. Black-tailed deer have returned. And that takes us out now to the far edge of the forest, of the blast zone, where we have the scorched zone, or the zone of the standing dead, where the trees were cooked, but the power to knock them down had dissipated. And there you can see it again. Those trees are falling down each winter. More and more of them fall down. And then if you go beyond that scorched zone, you come to the intact forest. But much of the forest up there, although intact, was coated with this adherent coating of ash, which persisted for a few months and retarded their growth. So they suffered some impact, but not nearly what the rest of the forest had suffered. And then if you go out further, you'll eventually come to the intact forest that was simply unaffected by the blast. So we've gone through our disturbance gradient now, and let me just take a very few minutes and just go back to this question that we posed. Do the recovery themes illustrated at Mount St. Helens provide insight into how the Earth recovered biologically in the post-Noahic flood period? And if so, what is that insight? Interesting, here is a quote from the a publication from the Pacific Northwest Research Station of the U.S. Forest Service that was just put out. And what it reads is this: the in-depth ecological research on Mount St. Helens and at other volcanoes is enabling researchers to identify universal themes in ecosystem response to disturbance. In other words, the secular scientific community believes that recovery themes observed at Mount St. Helens have general, even universal applicability to other disturbances, and that would logically include something like Noah's flood. It's important to notice also that there are some similarities between Noah's flood and what happened at Mount St. Helens. Obviously differences as well, but both were catastrophic geologic events involving volcanism, flooding, massive erosion, deposition, same processes. In each, there was destruction of a pre-disturbance ecosystem. In each, there were biological legacies that were abundant, and in each, there was initiated the process of recovery, which continues on at Mount St. Helens, of course. Here are 8 of the themes that we listed before, and I could put up many more, but I won't. And let me skim through these quickly and just see if we think they relate to Noah's flood at all. The first is resilience. Severely disturbed ecosystems at Mount St. Helens are recovering well. In other words, they are proving very resilient. The overarching observation at the mountain lends credibility to the idea that the entire Earth actually could recover from a global catastrophe like Noah's flood. It's hard to believe the Earth could recover, but we look at a big disturbance, not a global one, but a big one, we find recovery goes much more rapidly than we think, and that lends credibility to the belief that things actually could recover from Noah's flood. Biological legacies. That's an important concept for the flood also. What were the biological legacies of Noah's flood? What would they logically be? Well, in the ark would be man, land animals, and what I call hitchhikers, the incidental insects, bacteria, fungi, and so forth that were in seeds and so forth that were there. In the floodwaters, we would have fishes, amphibians, aquatic invertebrates, and aquatic plants. On floating log mats and vegetation mats, similar to what we see in Spirit Lake, would be plants and fungi and seed and spores and insects and such. There would also be pumice rafts. You know, when a volcano erupts under the Pacific Ocean, it spreads out this huge raft of pumice, floating pumice, and it floated at Mount St. Helens. And on that could be marine creatures and even insects and such. That's been demonstrated in the modern world. So it certainly would think would happen after the flood. In the atmosphere, things can even survive. Very tiny spores, very tiny seeds. Certain insects can stay aloft for great periods of time. And buried in the flood sediments, sort of like the sediments at Mount St. Helens, could be plants and invertebrates and other things that, if they were exposed, would live, would survive. So following the flood, places with abundant legacies would become hotspots, as the term, using the terminology of Mount St. Helens, of biological recovery. Imagine a huge floating log mat on the floodwaters, gets grounded, and all those trees, plant material, and all the organisms in there are now on the ground. You would have a big area of fairly rapid biological recovery occurring after the flood. Immigration after the flood must have involved short and long distances. For example, with the hotspot illustration, organisms could simply immigrate by spreading out from that area into their more immediate surroundings. But on the other hand, animals and man and the ark would have dispersed from a point source, the mountains of Ararat. And notice this, the long-distance travelers, like man and the animals from the ark, that would take some time for them to get around the Earth. But that time would have allowed plants, invertebrates, fishes, and other organisms that were not on the ark and were there already. It would allow them time to establish, start recovering, and provide existing food and habitat for the travelers from the ark as they arrived. Next is the requirement for geological stability. I don't think it takes too much imagination to think that the world after Noah's flood had to be a pretty unstable place. There would have been breaching of natural dams, local flooding, landslides, dust storms, rivers changing course frequently, volcanoes erupting, and so forth. And we would think that plants and life itself would not recover very well in those places. But in those areas that were stable, there would be more recovery, and as areas stabilized, then recovery would follow that. Erosion, we mentioned, and it certainly seems reasonable that after the flood, erosion through some of the flood sediments would unearth and expose plants that were still viable, seeds, maybe or animals like clams or things that would survive in sediments for a period of time, and that they would live and recover. And certainly, post-flood aquatic habitats would recover faster than drier ones. Just think of Spirit Lake. It was such a degraded body of water. Would it not be true that all bodies of water on the entire globe would be highly degraded after the flood? And would they not have to recover by some sort of a process similar to what we saw at Mount St. Helens? One would think that's likely the case. Insects in the post-flood world, well, they didn't have all their predators intact. Insects would have thrived, but because they didn't have the birds and the bats and the small rodents right away. But would not insecticide ash from erupting volcanoes play a role in controlling those populations of insects? And lastly, we should mention humans. Humans play a role in biological recovery, certainly. And at Mount St. Helens, humans salvaged log, planted conifer seedlings, built roads, sowed grass seed to control erosion. Didn't work very well, but they did it. Stabilized Spirit Lake with a drainage tunnel, established a national monument, did all kinds of things. All these activities affected recovery. In a similar fashion, post-flood man would have hunted, developed agriculture, built roads and houses, and probably intentionally transported animals and plants across the earth. Well, those are just some ideas. Start maybe in trying to develop some sort of a reasonable model of what did happen after the flood. Can't prove all of that, but these sound like reasonable things, although somewhat speculative. I think this needs to be worked on and thought about more, and more evidence brought to bear on this issue. So I think that's enough said, and so I'll be glad to answer questions after our break as time permits, and thank you for your attention.
Questions right now, and when you think of your questions, I want to remind you the way we support these meetings is to take a free will offering so we can bring in speakers like this. I much appreciated Keith coming. Yeah, we've been to Mount St. Helens a number of times and seen the scenery, and hopefully this will give you a desire to go on one of these tours and see what really happened there. So we're going to take a free will offering, and remember, we're a 501c3 organization, nonprofit, and if you want to get a tax break, we'll need a record, and either check or put it in an envelope with your name on it, and then we'll get you a receipt for tax purposes. So if the men could come up and do that while you're thinking of questions you might have, I will bring the microphone up to you because we want to record the question as well as the answer. So, questions that people may have. I don't think you stumped them that well.
I answered them all.
This is your chance to stump the professor. Here's your chance. Yeah.
I was surprised you didn't mention the layering.
I'm sorry?
The layering of sediments, like went down the Toutle compared to the Grand Canyon.
That's a very important point. I didn't mention it because I'm talking about the biology primarily. But you're very correct that there was rapid formation of layering in the sediments, and that is analogous or can be compared to rock layers, for example, in Grand Canyon. At Mount St. Helens, we saw the layering occurred very rapidly. At Grand Canyon, we're told it took millions of years. So we have something in real life time that I think sheds some light on Grand Canyon.
Next.
It occurs to me that after the flood, there were a lot of fossils formed because of rapid burial. Now, you've alluded to the rapid burial of the old growth forests, and of course a lot of animals who were killed, that sort of thing. Have there been any fossils discovered in the aftermath of Mount St. Helens, or anything that appears to be progressing towards fossilization?
Well, I think the answer is I know of no definite evidence of fossils being formed, and that's a very good point that you make. The question, we usually think of fossils. What does it take to make a fossil? And what most people say, well, it takes millions of years, and then it turns to a fossil. But I think the key thing in making a fossil is you need the right conditions. I have a friend who made a fossil of a pickle in a couple of days in her kitchen because she had the right conditions, the right solution. I don't think the conditions were optimal for fossil formation at Mount St. Helens, although there was rapid burial, but probably you need waters containing the proper amount of minerals that are soaking, those organisms that are buried, for them to incorporate those minerals and turn into fossils. So, I'm not aware of any conclusive proof that there's any fossils formed, because I don't think the conditions were optimal for fossil formation, and they were after the flood. Okay.
Another question here.
How does the pumice act as a pesticide for insects?
Yeah, that's a good question too. The pumice or the ash, they're really the same thing. The ash is like a fine powder. And if you look under the microscope, it's all got sharp angles. It's little sharp particles. And what that does is it abrades or it scratches off part of the surface of the insects. Insects are covered by what's called an exoskeleton, their hard skeleton. And there's some wax associated with that, and it braids that off. And they lose water. Their water just seeps out. And they dry up and die. It also plugs up their breathing pores called spiracles, and it also clogs up their intestines. Imagine if you were eating ash. Not good, right? So in several ways, it kills insects. What's that again? Airplane engines, yes, and it doesn't help car engines either. And people in those days were carrying around spare air filters in their trunk. We were, I know.
Another question here.
I was just thinking, no doubt there was a provision for fresh water after the flood, but based on the example you were given in St. Helens, it was, putrid water. It wouldn't have been drinkable. So I was just curious if you could maybe give me an example of how that might have looked like after the flood, because obviously they survived for some time before there was the water systems recovered.
Yeah, the question is how fish survived, basically, in such a...
Humans as well, for a period of time.
So I'm a little hard of hearing. Maybe I missed part of it.
Well, humans as well. Like there were 8 that survived the flood. So, what would have been the provision for fresh water after a worldwide flood?
I see what you're saying. I don't know for sure, but certainly there was rain. And rainwater can be collected. Maybe they collected it ahead of time. Maybe they had quite a bit of it on the ark to begin with. And so maybe it rained, after the flood, and that would be one source. The bodies of water were degraded, but maybe not all of them were undrinkable. We don't know that. That's another possible source. There's certain organisms could lose, like dew and so forth, readily. Good question. There's probably much more one could say if I thought about it. But could boil it. You could maybe try to purify it yourself. Maybe they had a way of doing that. That's a good thing. Filter it, boil it. Very good, very true.
Any more questions? If not, we'll close this out. Keith will be available to answer more questions in the back here when we're finished. And thank you, Keith.
Yeah.